Hi, everybody. Thank you. So I'd like to thank everybody for, as I move around here, I'd like to thank you all for being here. I'd like to thank Dr. Paik for inviting me to come and give this talk, and thank all of the faculty at the Academy here for having me and hosting me and being wonderful to me. So thank you very much. It's an honor and a privilege to be here to talk with everybody today. I will be talking about this particular topic, and I actually have prepared this relatively academic talk that talks about data and research and all that kinds of stuff about what I know about Japanese culture and society and individuals and whatnot. I thought that before I jump into this part of my talk, I'd give you a little background as to my experiences and where I'm coming from, so that you have an idea of the kind of data sources that I have in giving you this talk. I am a third-generation Japanese American, born in Hawaii, 1959, 50 years ago. Actually, Hawaii was not a state yet. It was a territory when I was born there. But I'm a third-generation Japanese, which means that my grandparents immigrated from Japan to Hawaii. I don't know if you guys know, but in the late 1800s, early 1900s, a lot of people from Japan immigrated to the United States to work in the plantations, especially in Hawaii and the West Coast. Brazil also, outside of Japan. The largest community of Japanese immigrants is actually in Sao Paulo, Brazil. But anyway, my grandparents immigrated around 1900, and my parents were born in Hawaii as the second generation, and I was the third generation. And I'm just mentioning that because different ethnicities count the generations differently. I don't know if you guys know that. Some of them count the first one born in the States as the first generation. The Japanese Americans happen to count the first ones coming as the first generation. But my introduction to Japanese culture was actually living as a Japanese American in that time, because and I didn't realize it then, but I think it's an interesting and important point to mention for all of us. And that is, when we were growing up in those communities, and I'm sure this is true, I know this is true for many other immigrant communities as well, that those communities that immigrated to the United States really maintained their lifestyles and their ways of life for many years as they were in their ethnic communities. And I'm sure not only was it true for the Japanese Americans, but it's also true for the Chinese, the Filipinos, everybody on the West Coast. I'm sure it was true for the Greeks and the Italians and everybody else on the East Coast as well. The first few generations were very, very traditional. In fact, in the 1970s, when I was a kid growing up, I still remember when I was at my grandparents' place, every night before we go to bed, we're out outside the house chopping wood. And the reason why we're chopping wood, no problem, come on in, have a seat, make yourself at home. The reason why we're chopping wood is because the next morning we're lighting the fire to do two things: to boil water, because you can use the boiled water for the early morning washing and doing all that stuff, and to cook the rice. And we cook the rice outside in a pot above the fire, hanging above the fire. Now this is in the 1970s. There's easily rice cookers inside. My grandparents had rice cookers, and you could just wash the rice and plug it in and hit the thing like you do today. But no, it wasn't like that. We would always just cook the rice outside in the boiling pot above the fire. Now why did they do that? Because that's the way they did it back in the 1800s, and they brought that way of life to the United States, and they just maintained that. And when you have these ethnic groups that come to the United States, they get what I consider crystallized cultures. Their cultures crystallized at a certain time, and they just maintained that over 60, 70, 80 years, and that's just the way they did things. We could easily have gone inside and used the rice cooker, but we never did that. They could have easily, my grandparents smoked. They could have easily gone to the store and bought a pack of cigarettes. No, they would always buy the little wraps and wrap their little tobacco and do that stuff. They could easily do with all of the creature comforts that we had learned to have even by the 1970s, but they never did that. They just kept their cultural ways of life. And you find this with many ethnic groups in the United States. I don't know if you guys know, about 10 years ago, there was this movie called My Big Fat Greek Wedding. You guys watch that? Yeah. You ever talk to somebody from Greece about that wedding? They'll say, they never do that. It looks like they're looking at 100 years ago. But Greek Americans, crystallized that way of life. That's what they do. And if you look at every ethnic group that I've read about, talked about, heard about, it's always like that. The first, second, third generation, it's very traditional. So for me, it was like living in, you guys are studying Japanese culture and history, right? The Meiji period around 1868. I grew up in a Meiji Japanese culture because that was the culture that my grandparents brought to my family. When I first went to Japan in 1972 and saw the changes, I was shocked because it was so different. It was modern. I thought Japanese culture was like what I knew from my living, and it was totally different. So this is the, I'm telling you this because this is the part of my experiences. This is the Japanese culture that I knew when I was growing up. So that's one thing. A second part of my life that kind of informs this particular topic is my experiences in the sport of judo. So as Dr. Pike had mentioned, I do judo. I've done judo since I was 7 years old. That makes 43 years of doing judo. I'm still on the mat every day that I'm at home. Have been coaching. Did a lot of judo as a competitor when I was younger. Hi. Yeah, come on in. Became a national coach for the United States in 1989. I was a national coach for 11 years. I was head of the coaching staff from 93 to 2000. I was the head coach for our Olympic team in 96 and 2000. So doing that kind of stuff, I spent a lot of time in Japan, in addition to my professional work. And it's really good because, when you do this science stuff, when you're in the university doing research, it's kind of like you're in this special world that's insulated from reality to some degree. And you get data and you get stuff, you get findings, you get statistics on it, but it's really an insulated world. And then from the other side of it, I'm spending all my time doing judo. I'm in the nastiest places of the earth, going through the worst training conditions with the worst possible people, eating the worst possible grub, and just in the worst possible situations, and seeing what people are like. And so you get a sense. I've traveled to maybe about 45 countries in the world, and you get a sense of what people are like and what's very similar about them and what's very different about them. And so I have this perspective that informs what I bring to you today. And then I have this perspective, this third perspective, which is this doing research about Japanese culture and personality, which I'd like to now talk with you about. So here are 4 basic areas that I'm going to be talking about today. One has to do with a common view of Japanese culture, and I think of individuals. Then we're going to review evidence from the scientific literature about what the evidence says that corroborates or not this common view of Japanese culture. We're going to talk about this issue that I call levels of analysis. We're going to talk about the difference between cultures and individuals, and then I'll have some concluding remarks. So these 4 major points of my talk. Let's start with the common view of Japanese culture. Now, I happen to believe that when you study Japanese culture, language, personality, people, society, you get a pretty consistent picture of what the culture is kind of like. It doesn't matter where you start reading. There's very classic works starting with Lafcadio Hearn and Benedict, Dore, Reischauer, Morris, etc., that are written by non-Japanese people. But if you read them, you get a fairly consistent picture of what the culture is like and what the people are like. I bet a lot of you have a fairly consistent picture of what Japanese culture is like and what Japanese people are like as well. Interestingly, when you read Japanese individual writers writing about Japanese culture, it is also very consistent with itself and with the Western writing. And I'm just listing a few here. If you read, I put this book up here, Nitobe's Bushido, which is the art of, I don't know how you, how do you translate Bushido? Anyway, it's the martial arts way. And he wrote this in the late 1900s, or early 1900s. If you read Nakane-chie or Doi or Minami, I mean, if you read very many people in Japan writing about Japanese culture, you find that you get a very consistent view with what the Westerners also think. By the way, studying Japan is a really common and very popular thing in Japan. You know, it's like they like to study themselves, they like to talk about themselves and whatnot. I'm sure you heard about Japanese modesty, you know, and that Japanese are modest, but they don't boast, but they boast about their modesty, right? So, but anyway, we're gonna get to that. So you get this very common view of what Japanese culture and people are like. And even when you look at the literature, nowadays it's anime, you know, it's games, you know, if you're looking at the media and whatnot, you get a very clear picture of this common view. This common view has these kinds of Japanese terms of sincerity and collectivism and perseverance and this spiritual toughness and all that kind of stuff that you associate with samurai and you know, that genre of understanding. The shame culture, respect, this relationships, and all this kind of honor, courage, and things like that. This is, I believe, a very common view of Japanese culture and society. Well, the question that I would pose, that has been posed in our research and the research of others, is, are these views of Japanese culture and people true? And what's interesting is that there's enough data over the last 20, 30 years where people have actually studied what the people are like, to see whether the common views of Japanese culture actually are consonant with what the people are like in Japan. So let me show you what the data look like, okay, from these various studies. And I think we're going to go and talk about the evidence, and I have prepared like 12 different areas of data. I don't think we're going to have the time, or maybe we will, I don't know. Depends how fast I go through them. But there's 12 areas that I just selected out where I know that there's data on what Japanese people are like with regard to their culture, and we can compare what it refers to, or how it compares to with the common view of Japanese culture. And we're going to start with this thing called individualism versus collectivism. Now, if you study anything about culture in psychology, or in even cultural anthropology, you will come across these terms undoubtedly called individualism and collectivism. Individualism and collectivism is this very large social psychological construct that can be used, that has been used to differentiate many cultures around the world. Individualism refers to cultures that foster the needs, wishes, and desires of individuals over their in-groups. You know, the individual is always put number one. The individual is always gets the most of the needs and the wishes over the group. So in individual cultures are thought to foster competition and uniqueness and autonomy and separateness and freedom. Okay? And traditionally, what the cultures of the world that are thought to be very individualistic are the United States, Great Britain, Australia, New Zealand, you know, it's the former British Empire basically, that are thought to be very individualistic. On the other hand, there's this construct called collectivism. It's the polar opposite of individualism. With collectivistic cultures, you've got cultures that foster the group over the individual. You know, the group always comes first. So collectivistic cultures foster values such as cooperation, harmony, and conformity. And so when people in the literature talk about collectivistic culture, you know, when we talk about individualistic cultures, we think, oh, United States. When we think about collectivistic cultures, we think Japan. This is one of the common views that's out there. Well, what do the data say? One of the most widely known cross-national surveys of cultural values was done by Gerd Hofstede back in the late 1960s. He's replicated these findings many, many times. And he's asked people in many, many cultures around the world to respond to value surveys. And one of the values that is mentioned on that is measured on the survey is individualism and collectivism. And when you study the data, when you examine the data on the group level, what you find is, yes, indeed, the United States comes out #1 in individualism, but out of 70 countries, Japan ranks number 27. Now, of course, that's more collectivistic than the United States, but out of 70 countries, they rank number 27. That doesn't sound that collectivistic. I mean, what that's saying is that there's the other, 53 countries that are more collectivistic than Japan on this scale. And it's true on other scales as few. If you get familiar with this literature, there's several people like the Schwartz Value Survey, it's the Globe Project, there's several projects that have done this kind of work. You get the same finding. Now, this is an assessment of the country level, where the countries stand. So this is, the United States comes out to be #1. Of course, there's a misnomer there too, right? Like, what does it mean that the United States is #1 in individualism? Does that mean that every single person in here is an individualistic person? I mean, if you got the Mars person coming over here and looking at this classroom right now, they're going to think, wow, there's a big conformist group there. Look at all of them sitting, #1, listening, #2, half dozing off. No, not half dozing off. In their uniforms. I mean, can you imagine what we look like to outsiders who have no idea of what's going on? But anyway, so there's a misnomer on the other side as well. But if you look on the individual level, you can actually go and look at data from surveys that have measured individualism and collectivism on the individual level with individual people. So let's look at some of this kind of data. Here's data, and this is data that I just started pulling out of the hat from the research literature about 10 years ago. And here's data from this one study published in the scientific literature, where they actually gave a questionnaire of collectivism, 2 questionnaires, to Americans and Japanese students. And they found on one scale there was no differences, while on the other scale, the Americans actually were scoring more collectivistic. Here's data from, okay, so then I used to present this to some people and they say, it's American researchers, so that must be the bias there. Well, if you look at Japanese researchers who do the same thing, what you find here is that here's the collectivism scale data. Sorry, you guys can't see this now. And you're looking at 2 groups of Americans, Koreans, and the Japanese. The Japanese are no different than the Americans. The Koreans are really collectivistic, but the Japanese were not in this study as well. Well, we've done this kind of research several times, and what you find is that in university students, this is the ratio of individualists and collectivists in the university student population, and this is like over 10 years ago. I bet you if you do this today in Japan, this part of the graph is larger. And there's a lot of individualistic people in Japan, who score very individualistic on these things. A few years ago, my colleague Daphne Oyserman at the University of Michigan did this meta-analysis. A meta-analysis is an analysis where you take all the previous findings of all the previous studies and you statistically kind of analyze all of them at one time. So she did this meta-analysis of 50 studies comparing European Americans with people from other nations and other ethnic groups in the United States and out. And what she found was that Americans were significantly higher on collectivism than the Japanese, across 50 studies. Here's an interesting study, because these researchers took Hofstede's original scales. You remember Hofstede was the guy that did that original 70-country study. He took the original scales, administered them to Canadians and Japanese students, and found no differences. So, and I'm just cherry picking some findings, but if you look across the research literature, what you find is that there's no data to support the contention that Japanese individuals are collectivistic, or that they're more collectivistic than Americans, or that American individuals are more individualistic than the Japanese. In fact, if you look at the level of data, what you find is that contention is more myth than reality. Yeah.
Professor, could you just clarify whether these studies are evaluating values or behavior, or are they both?
That's a great question. These are all, in here, they're all questionnaire studies. So they're all estimating values, self-reported values.
Okay.
Why do you think that might be an interesting thing to differentiate?
I just was wondering, well, because there's sometimes a discrepancy, I would guess, between values and behavior.
Yeah, and to tell you the truth, the studies that have tried to examine the correlation between how much values actually predict behavior shows that values predict behavior about 10% of the time. Well, now what does that mean? Now that has a lot of implications. You know, it means that when I come here and do a study, or somebody gets your self-report, and you're right now blah 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 blah, that probably has little to do with what you actually do. So all of these kinds of studies always have to be taken with that grain of salt. Now, and that's true not only of these studies, but any self-report study. So that's a really good point. But that doesn't mean that it's not important for something. So, you know, it gives us some kind of comparison base for something. But it's always the difference between attitudes, values, beliefs, opinions, and then actual behavior. Because on the level of behavior, as you're going to find out, and is what I can tell you, on the level of behavior, people are amazingly similar all around the world. You know, just we are more creatures of our own of the social context in which we are in. But if we are all kind of placed in the same social context, we all kind of behave quite similarly. You know. Anyway, but that's a great question. Any other questions about that? Let's move on. Let's talk a little bit about self-construals. This is a concept in psychology that refers to how you perceive yourself. It is very commonly thought that in individualistic cultures foster this thing called independent self-concepts. That is, we see ourselves as a bounded, unique, autonomous being. That other people in our lives exist, but they are clearly separate from us. It is also thought that in collectivistic cultures foster interdependent self-understanding, self-controls, so that the boundary between oneself and another person is fuzzy. That you can not, basically you can't think of yourself as your one person, that you always think about others as part of yourself. This is the thought, okay? And so there's this thing called independent versus interdependent self. I mean, this is clearly a difference in how people may understand each other, because in our culture, we like to think of ourselves like this. In fact, in our culture, if you think of yourself like this, I mean, this is psychopathology, right? You got a problem, you're going to see a shrink, we're going to fix you here. You know? I mean, you're bounded with somebody else, oh my God, we're going to fix you. Likewise, in the other cultures, if you've got this norm, right, and you've got a person here, this is a maladjusted person. They're not getting along with anybody, right? They can't fit in. They don't adjust. They don't adapt, blah, 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 according to this common view of how this is supposed to work. Let's look at what data say. So, I mean, I'm going back to this. Of course, it is thought then that Americans are kind of like this. Japanese, because they're collectivistic, are kind of like this. All right, so then let's look at what the data say. So numerous studies have actually assessed these self-construals, and they don't support the notion that Japanese have interdependent selves relative to American independent selves. I mean, here's data from this one study again, Carter and Naval. They had a independent and interdependent self-construal scale in their survey. Again, it's a scale, but we take it with that grain of salt. But there's no differences between the Americans and the Japanese. Here's another report from another study, Gudikens et al. 1996. They had Americans, Japanese, Koreans, and Australians. And what you find is that there's no difference between the Americans and the Japanese. It's the first two bars here. The Koreans are very much more interdependent. And to tell you the truth, these differences are consonant with my understanding of what Japanese and Korean people are like relative to the United States. You know. Here's another study, another author, independent and interdependent scales. In this study, the Americans are scoring higher on interdependence. I mean, this is consonant with my experience as well. I think we like to think of ourselves as very individualistic people, but there's a lot of interrelationships and a lot of interdependence among us. But there's an ideology about talking about, oh, we're very individualistic, we're very autonomous. So there's an ideology, and the ideology is part of our culture, but it's not necessarily what people are always like. And clearly we see these differences in the data. Here's another study, US mainlanders, Hawaii, Japan, and Korea. Again, the same kind of pattern of findings. The Koreans very less independent. Hawaii, by the way, more interdependent. Yay, hi. So, I mean, if you look at the data, and these are just, again, a handful of studies, but I have seen many studies that try to assess this kind of stuff. You don't get data that support that contention. I believe that that contention is also not supported by the evidence. Here's another one. Because of these differences in self-construals, there's supposed to be this difference in what is called interpersonal consciousness. And that is the degree to which Japanese are conscious of or aware of others in their lives or environment. And so the Japanese are supposed to be higher on this kind of stuff because they have more interdependent selves. And like the Americans are not conscious of others is basically the thought. If you look at data that measures this interpersonal context, what you find is that the Americans generally score higher than the Japanese do. Here's data from a Japanese researcher looking across all of these different groups. The group that scored the lowest on interpersonal consciousness was Japanese men. Japanese women that I tell this finding to love this finding, except when they find out that Japanese women were third lowest. Let me see what else I got here. So, I mean, if you look at data from that particular aspect of independence and self-control, you don't find a difference. In fact, you're finding the opposite of what you're getting. Now, here's this interesting thing when we're talking about personality. Over the last 20 years in psychology, there's a view that has emerged that suggests that there's a number of traits that are universal, that we have a number of traits that are universal to everybody. There's a large consensus on the existence of 5 traits. It's neuroticism, extroversion, conscientiousness, openness, and agreeableness. Five traits. Some researchers of late say that there's 6, some would say 7, but everybody kind of agrees that there's 5. Okay, it's the 5, and it's called the 5-factor model in psychology. And so what these researchers have done is that they've gone all around the world measuring these kinds of traits in people of many, many different cultures, including the United States and Japan. Well, here's recent data from a study of mine that looks at personality differences. And what you find is that, let's see, the Japanese are higher on neuroticism. Kind of makes sense. If you've been in the country, you talk to Japanese people, they're a little bit more emotionally unstable because they're more anxious, they're more worried about stuff in general. Americans tend to be more extroverted. That makes sense. Everybody's kind of social and you like to talk and like to interact with others a lot more. But here's something that kind of always gets me. Americans score higher on conscientiousness. Now, of course, with Toyota having its problems nowadays, maybe this is true. Right? Maybe these are all Toyota employees. I don't know. But this finding has occurred many times, not only in my studies, but in other people's studies as well. Everybody who studies these 5-factor traits, comparing the Americans with Japanese in other countries, you always find Japanese are higher in neuroticism, Americans are higher in extroversion, and Americans are higher in conscientiousness. How does this figure? You know, we have this stereotype of the worker bee, right? Going in, riding the 2-hour trains to go to work. How many of you have ever been in Japan? How many of you have ridden on the morning rush hour? Isn't that a fun experience? Where you're packed in so tight? You know, you guys, the rest of you, just to give you a little tip, you know, you never carry a bag or anything like that onto the train when you're going on the morning rush. You know why? It gets stuck and you never get it out. So everybody goes empty-handed. You know, you can carry your lunch bag or something like that, and it'll be, when you leave, you have to pull yourself away from it, and it'll be stuck in between people so tight that you would literally not get this thing out. So why am I talking about this? Yeah, so you have this thought about the conscientiousness. You're riding the train for 2 hours one way to work. You're there at 6 in the morning. You're going to work to 8, 9, 10, 11 at night. Go 2 hours back. Hit the train the next day. Doing this 6, 7 days a week, all for company and good and for the country. But why this, right? I don't understand this. Yeah.
So if these are again self-reported, it's related to having different social stereotypes that Japanese people who fill in the surveys are self-depreciating compared to their perceived stereotype.
Oh, that's a very good point. That's a very good point. Hold on to that. We're going to come back to that. Okay? All right. So when you look at the personality data on the mean levels, you don't get this picture of what you think should happen. I mean, you get it for over there, but you don't get it over here. In fact, when you put that data together across many of the countries, like these researchers, Alec and McCrae, they actually did this. They actually measured the 5-factor model of personality in 36 countries. They've actually done it in 50 since then. And they do this magic statistics thing. You know, you wave your wand and you get this magic result. This is how statistics generally works. You wave your wand and you get a result. Thank you for those 2 of you who are alive and listening to me. Thank you for laughing at that. That was good. So you wave your wand, or they wave their wand, and they get this magic result where they plot all the countries according to how similar or different they are. And here's their plot. Oh, where's Japan? Japan is kind of looking like Spanish, Russian, Belgians, and Portuguese. They're in that cluster. I mean, this is a graphical representation of the cultural distances, you know, from different cultures based upon their personality data. The Japanese are right there. Spain, Russia, Belgium, France, Portugal, Italians. Now, some people say, oh, okay, maybe it's McCrae's data. McCrae's data is faulty. Maybe it's this 5-factor model that's faulty. Well, here's the results from a colleague of mine, Shalom Schwartz. You know this very well, the Schwartz value scale. Shalom Schwartz has studied values all around the world, got samples from the university students as well as adult teachers, so that you know that your findings are not biased to the students. 67 cultures around the world. He waves the magic wand, tries to plot all of the cultures, and here's what you get. Where's Japan? It's like finding Waldo, right? Where's Japan? Japan's right there nearest to Israel on the Schwartz value scale. Yeah, I wonder why that is. In fact, oh, never mind, I won't go there. So anyway, you see, when you plot the data, when you look at the mean data like this, when you look at cross-cultural comparison data like this, Japan's not scoring anywhere near what you think it should look like on this kind of stuff. So this thought about what the Japanese are like in terms of their personalities, just not coming out with the data. Now, one question, I'm going to address this several times, but one question is, okay, what about the social desirable responding issue here? Why would that affect one scale but not the others? You know what I mean? I mean, when you start thinking about cultural response sets or social desirable responding or something that is affecting the way people are interacting with measures, which is a great thought, one has to then use that concept to explain all of the data, not parts of it, right? So one question, which we're going to come to, is why could that explain this but not explain that? So yeah.
It kind of looks like the Americans are putting a checkbox next to all the ones that sound good, and the Japanese are putting a checkbox next to the ones that don't sound good.
Okay, but why would then being sociable doesn't sound good in Japan? Yeah, I mean, it could be. But yeah, so a question then becomes, what's the social value of the items that are being rated, which is a great thought. So, you know, so there's a bunch of other kinds of data that we can look at. People think, you know, this thought, where I'm going way back here, this thought, that there's this self-concept here in the United States and there's this self-concept here in Japan. I mean, quite frankly, that's really primitive. Because in reality, what you find is, as if you get to it, is this big complex slide which says that in reality, we all have both kinds of selves. We all have an individual part of ourself, and we all have what we may call a collective part of ourself, and we all have what's called a relational part of ourselves. It's not that we all have one or the other. We have all of them, but we have them in different degrees. And so we all have different types of self-construals. Each of the different types of self-construals exist in people of different cultures and to different degrees depending upon the culture. And the different types of selves that we have differ depending upon the context in we're in, because how you are right now is different than how you are when you're at home, in your dorms, how you are, and that's different than when you're on the field doing something, or when you're at your hometown doing something. You're all different depending upon the context, and that's the way we all are. We all have this potential of different selves that are brought out or not depending upon the particular context that we're in, and we switch from one mode or the other depending upon the context. This is how people are more like than people are individualistic or people are collectivistic. I mean, that just doesn't fly. You know, so what's really going on is that we've got these different types of selves that we access depending upon the context that we're in. And in fact, different behaviors can be elicited in the same individuals if different construals are primed. So what that means is that, let me get to this, let me put that on hold and let me go straight to, where am I? Here. Here's different studies. Now we're talking about actual behaviors. Here's studies where if you get people who are, to put them in a situation where they cooperate with somebody else or not. Okay? And my colleague Toshio Yamagishi at Hokkaido University has done this research for the last 20 years. Puts them in a situation, they're going to interact with each other, with another person. The person's either an in-group member, an out-group member, or a friend or not. Sometimes they get Americans and Japanese to interact with each other over the internet, you know, and you got Skype going and you see each other and do all that kind of crap. Oh, I didn't say that. Do all kinds of stuff. And you measure the amount of cooperative behavior that you see. Now, in a certain situation, what you find is that the Japanese start to cooperate with each other more than Americans do. So then it's part of this common stereotype that people have. Oh, they're more cooperative. Japanese culture is more harmonious. So people are more cooperative, blah, 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 blah. But in reality, if you change the nature of the social sanctions in the context, if you change the nature of the rules in the context, what he's been able to find is that he can get the Americans to be more cooperative than the Japanese, and vice versa. You know, you can just change the nature of the social rules in the context, and you get different types of behaviors from the same individuals. So what that means is that it's not that one group is more cooperative than the other. It's that one group is living within social sanctions that facilitate certain behaviors more than another. But that's a big difference than what making a big conclusion about what people are like. Yeah.
Professor, you're relating to the internet, and I was just wondering, has there been any talks on what the internet or technology bringing the world closer together has had on the effects of I guess just having everything average out with more shared ideas?
Oh yeah, sure. I think the internet is, there's some data, so directly to your question, there's some data to suggest that that's what's happening. I don't think it's necessarily because of the internet. It's something that has started with mass media that starts with the Hollywood movies. So there's Hollywood movies, and then there's magazines, there's print, there's stuff that we can see. Then the internet, there's the next logical extension of this thing where we have information sharing that's going around that people can then see what other people are like. So for example, where we see this in our work is one of the things that I study are cultural gestures. And gestures are very culture specific, right? So like this or this or this. These originate in some cultures and in a culture, and they have a specific meaning in that culture. And we used to think that all gesture vocabularies of different cultures are all very different. But what we're finding now is that there's some limited set of gestures that almost everybody around the world understands what they are. And it's probably because of the internet. It's probably because of movies and then the internet. Because people are seeing, like what you're doing right now, like this. This means yes, right? In most cultures, this means yes. In some cultures, it's not like that. But in most cultures, this is yes. But when people see Americans do that, they can kind of understand that that's what means yes, because they see Americans do it on the internet. They see them doing it in Hollywood. So you see this, not this homogenization, but this kind of greater understanding of behavior because of that. So yeah, I think that happens. Other questions? All right, so we don't want to talk about these are more data that talks about certain kinds of social psychological phenomena. Basically, the thought is, I can go into detail later on if you want, but basically it's, oh, we think that Americans are like this, oh, we think that the Japanese are like this. When you actually measure it, it doesn't come out like that. One of the big areas in social psychology in the last 10 years is this thing about self-enhancement, self-esteem. It's related to that modesty and boasting that we talked about earlier. If you look at studies that measure self-esteem, or self-enhancement, which is how much you work to make yourself feel good. What you find is in every study that on a mean level, Americans, on a general questionnaire or behaviors, Americans work harder to make themselves feel good than Japanese do. So then some early people took that kind of finding and said, well, you see, Japanese don't have that self-enhancement motive. They don't have the need to make themselves feel good. Americans have the need to make themselves feel good. But the Japanese don't, because they're in this collectivistic culture and they're interrelated, and so they don't have that kind of stuff going on. But the latest studies show that that's not true. What really happens is that there's tactical self-enhancement. That they choose different contexts in which to enhance themselves, like boasting about modesty. Or there's this thing called mutual self-enhancement. What happens as a norm kind of in Japan is you're with your friend, oh, I feel terrible. And your friend will say, no, you're a great person. And that's one way of getting your self-esteem boost. It's that you're just not doing it, but this is part of the norm in the culture that you're getting someone else to do it for you. It's mutual self-enhancement. So there's these tactical ways in which these psychological processes are occurring. So we all have the same endpoint, which is making ourselves feel better about ourselves. We all need to do that. It's a healthy and normal thing to do. The thought that they don't do that, the Japanese or anybody doesn't do that, is crazy. We all do that. And that's what the research shows recently. Other similar findings about autonomy and control, we won't go through that. I talked about this. I want to talk about this before I turn to some kind of thoughts about what this all means. Some colleagues of mine, Hazel Marcus, Shinobu Kitayama, they published this finding a few years ago that looked at statements of Olympic medalists from the United States and Japan after they had won an Olympic medal. And what they found was that the Americans are typically, I worked hard, I deserve this, I was better than that other person, blah, blah, blah. So it's like me, 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 me. And the Japanese were, I did it for my family, and I love my coach, and I love my dog, and I did it for everything except me. So it's not me, not me, not me, not me. So when you look at they analyzed the statements of the media, and supposedly showed how the Americans talk. It's all talk about this individualistic way of understanding the world. So they conclude, and the Japanese were talking about these relationships and what their medals meant for the relationships. And they concluded that was evidence for how the Japanese understood their world. The problem is, I've been to 4 Olympic Games and 10 World Championships in my sport. I've been in these press situations. So let me tell you what happens. The press comes with a script, a story that they're going to do on you, or you, or you. I mean, whoever's going to be there, they've got their story that they're going to do on you. So a typical thing goes like this. Here's an example. When I was in a press conference once, this Japanese player won a silver medal, wasn't thought to going to be a medal contender, got a silver medal, great achievement, right? He's coming into the press conference, the press from Japan. So he's, press conferences, they just start, they talk. So he's going, it's his turn. He's going, I worked hard, I did this, I deserve this, I've been waiting for, I sacrificed for 35 years, he's 23 years old, and I deserve this medal, and I blah, 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 blah. He sounds like anybody else, quite frankly. Then the press asked the question on their notes about his mother who broke the leg 6 months ago when they were in the training. Oh, can you comment about what your mother and your broken leg and blah, blah. Oh, yes, I got this medal from my mom. she made great achievements for me. It was a great sacrifice that she did, and everything is about my family. So then, what goes into the paper? What goes into the media spot? It's that. So the media then choose certain things to place in there that meet a certain ideology that they wanna foster. But are people like that? I don't think so. If you look at every Olympic medalist, regardless of what medal they come from, regardless of what country they come from, they kind of say the same stuff. You know, it doesn't matter whether you're looking at Phelps in 2008. Look at what's her name last week? What's her name? Sorry. Yeah, Lindsey Vonn, and all those people. I mean, you know, they say the same stuff. If you just let them talk, they say the same things. But what you see in print or on media is what the media is carving out to make a story about an ideological point. So it's a very important point to take in terms of grain of salt when you see these kinds of findings. And I kind of wrote about this kind of stuff in a rebuttal article back here about this kind of stuff. So, in summary, I know I didn't review all 12, but just take my word for it. You know, it's kind of there. The data are there. Wait, who's laughing? Stop that. 12 bodies of evidence that I did not review, but they, you know, if you look at the data, I believe it's a balanced review. I've published this kind of stuff in peer-reviewed journals. Nobody's ever said, hey, go look at that other stuff over there. I mean, the data's out there. If you look at the data, what you find is that there's no support for the contention that Japanese individuals are a certain way and American individuals are a different way, at least not according to this common view of collectivism in Japan. So what to make of this? Let's move here and talk about one big issue that I think that we all face, both in our work as researchers, as people in the world here, as you guys in the military, and going out there and working in different cultures. Let's talk a little bit about this particular issue. And that's the difference between cultures and individuals. One thing that we all have to make a big differentiation about is the difference between culture and people. To me, culture is a social level phenomenon. Individuals are not cultures. Individuals may be members of cultures. They're agents of cultures. They may have mental representations of their culture, but they're not culture. Culture is like the system of social rules and norms or rituals that we have to live in. It's this system that we live in. There's a culture here in this academy. And it's a different culture here in this academy than it is in other academies. It's a different culture in the Navy than there is in the Army or in the Air Force. And just as there's a different culture between Louisiana and New York and Hawaii and California, as well as the United States and Japan and everywhere else in the world. But they refer to different systems of rules, structure of rules, of rituals, attitudes and behaviors as well. But the systems are not people. People have to live within these systems. And the problem is that we start thinking about cultures and then we stereotype individuals as being just their culture. And this is where the problem comes, when we start stereotyping the individuals to be parts of these cultures. It's clear to me that Japanese culture as a social level construct, if you guys have ever been there, you know that the system is different. How things are done is different. The nature of the rules are different, whether they're written rules like in laws or unspoken rules like in customs. The rules are different. That's what the culture is. The people happen to just be living under those rules. If you live under those rules, you will engage in behaviors that are more like those rules because you have to conform. We all conform to whatever rules we have. You know, it's just that some of us have rules of nonconformity. But when you conform to rules of nonconformity, you're just being nonconformist, but you're being nonconformist to rules of nonconformity. Does that make sense? That was pretty quick, huh? But the rules are not the people. So we got to think about people as being very different, and we can't stereotype the people as being parts of as being the culture. Again, it's clear to me that American culture is also very individualistic. But what does that mean? It means that we have a system of rules, a system of governance, a system of structure, of norms, of rules, of sanctions that encourages certain things and discourages others. But people themselves may or may not be like that on the individual level. So we always have to separate out our understanding of what individuals are like from what the culture as a whole is like. And to tell you the truth, I'm making a point about this because I've been working in the Department of Defense's space for human social cultural modeling, or whatever we want to call it, for the last few years. And I don't see this differentiation occurring a lot. And I'm very afraid of this. Because when we're training you guys to go out and interact with people of different cultures, it looks like we're giving you the Barron's guidebook to cultural tidbits of how to act with different cultural customs and thinking that that's okay. It's not. It really is not. I think we need to do a better job of figuring out what's the difference between social structures and culture and social systems, and then how we can translate that to helping you guys interact with people more effectively. People who happen to be from a different culture, people who happen to be living in a different culture, and you happen to be in a different culture when you're doing it. But on some level, it's people with people. And on some level, there's a lot of similarity between how you interact effectively if you had to go to a different culture here, even in the United States. On some level, it's very similar. It's having an amount of respect for each other, right? An amount of courtesy. You know, not coming in and believing that you're the arrogant king, that you can do everything else. I mean, it's these basic rules that you then apply. It becomes multiplied by the fact that you're in a different land, with a different geography, with a different ecology, with different languages. But on some level, it's the same stuff. It's people to people. So we have to do a better job at splitting out this cultural stuff from the individual stuff and knowing how to put this all together. Right? But again, I believe that one of the problems that we have in this understanding Japanese culture and personality, it's just an example to me of a larger issue, which is we don't do a good job of separating out individual versus cultural level of differences. And then there's all kinds of other stuff. We can find these differences. Let's say that personality difference, Americans are more conscious than Japanese. Why does that occur? Who knows? It might be social desirable responding. Response bias. It could be a cultural norm. If you ask people about themselves, some people are more reticent to talk about themselves, even on a questionnaire. That's true. So we have to ask it in many different ways. We have to get it in many different ways. One of the problems that us researchers have is that we have this one-shot deal at doing research. So we take data at one time. Like I could take a questionnaire from you today, right, on anything. And then I'll go and compare it with another group, and I'll say, oh, well, Naval Academy midshipmen, they're like this, and these other people, they're like that. But does that mean that you're like that all the time? And does that mean that that data is always valid all the time? Probably not. But the fact is that we do research like that, so we always have to take this kind of stuff with a grain of salt. And every time we have a difference, we don't know whether the difference is cultural, whether it's social rules, whether it's that particular context. Right? I'll give you an example. Here's a typical study in social psychology. Go into a classroom like this, ask you guys, rate yourself relative to all your peers on how much better you think you are, or worse, where you think you stand on a 0 to 100% scale, the number of people above and below you, on riding a bike, on reading an essay, on whatever the skill is. I'll ask you to do that rating. Okay? Do you know the average rating? The average number that comes out from a group of typical Americans, students, on any kind of thing that you asked them for? 75%. That's right. Who said that? 75%. It's a mathematical improbability, right? I mean, if you average it out, the average cannot be better than 75% of the group. It doesn't happen. And if you ask Japanese to do that kind of thing, what you get is the average is 50%. So some people used to think, aha, you see, Americans are like this and Japanese are like that. No, that's not true. If you get the same Japanese and you put a context on the question, like when you're in school and you're with these colleagues, rate yourself. Then you get to 50%. Then you get to 70%. You get the exact same thing that you get with Americans when you contextualize the questionnaire. In fact, if you ask that question to university professors, do you know what the average rate is in the United States? 95%. Of course, that never happens in the academy. So, but who knows what the source of these things are? Is it context? Is it biology? Who knows? We always have to be wary of that kind of stuff. But the stuff about the cultural versus individual, I think, is a very big difference. And I want to conclude soon so that we have some time for some other questions and comments so I can lie to you even more. But where are we going with all this kind of stuff? I mean, I'm very concerned about how we deal with culture. I mean, ever since we've been in the Middle East, more since 9/11, we're kind of dealing with culture. People tell us, okay, we got to deal with culture. What does that mean? Really, what does that mean? When you get really right down to it, what a lot of people have to do when they're on the ground is interact with other people. So it's not as much as learning about culture. I mean, you got to learn about culture. It's very important. But it's not only that. It's how do you interact with others in that kind of situation. Can you imagine in your hometown, wherever that was, you've been besieged, and you've got another army coming through. They got their hands on their weapons, and they're coming at you. They're raiding your house, and they're asking you questions in 5 minutes. How's a person supposed to behave then? Right? Put ourselves in that kind of situation. It's tough. So there's a person-to-person issue. And we got to deal with the person-to-person issue as well as the intercultural differences issue. We don't deal with systems. We have to deal with people within systems. So I think we need to be very wary of this kind of stuff. When you deal with people, I think there are many universal aspects to people that we find a common base to. I mean, when you're out there and you're dealing with people from a different culture, you're going to have an effective relationship. What's the first thing you do? It doesn't matter whether they come from a different culture or not. What is the first thing you do? You find something that you share, right? And we share a lot of things. Everybody's concerned about the same stuff. Am I going to be alive? Am I going to have food to eat? Am I going to find somebody to hook up with? Am I going to have a productive life? I mean, these are the same concerns all around the world. It's manifested in different ways, but these are many of the same concerns. If you have family, is my family going to be okay? Are my kids going to be okay? Is my wife and children safe? Are they safe? It's the same concerns everywhere. It's just that it's manifested in different ways. We can find many ways in which we can interact universally and then bridge the differences that exist, because the differences do exist. But we can't go in and I don't believe we can go in and interact effectively just hitting the differences. We go in and find the commonalities, and then we go and bridge those differences. And I think we start with an interpersonal process that recognizes the intercultural differences that we got. As I've been trying to drive home this point, cultures are not people. And there's a big difference between stereotypes versus reality. I've been talking a little bit about our current DoD efforts in addressing the challenges of culture. I want to end my talk by giving you this one research tidbit that we did a few years ago. Did this large study, looked at personalities all around the world, had people actually fill out questionnaires about themselves, and we had their third parties rate their behaviors about what the people are like. And so we get this kind of good idea of what people's personalities are like in these different cultures. Then we asked people to rate what the average American is like and other countries. And we got those people, Americans in other countries, to rate the other countries as well. So we got this cross-rating going on. What are they like? And what you find is that there's an amazing consensus on the stereotypes, right? Americans, all blonde, blue-eyed, go for it. I mean, I'm an American. I ain't got no blonde, blue eyes and whatnot. But anyway, there's an amazing consensus. I mean, you go out the rest of the world, we're supposed to be cowboys. You're going to be people are going to ask you for your hat, because they think we're cowboys. This is a stereotype out there. If you look at the data on the level of stereotypes, there's an amazing consensus. But what we could do was we could correlate the stereotypic ratings of the other group with the real ratings of that group. We could do that correlation. What's the average correlation around the world of that correlation? The stereotypic ratings of a group with the real ratings within that group. Average correlation. 0. 0. What that means is that the stereotype that we have of other people is not related at all to what the people are actually like. So I do believe that we have to have some caution in taking these stereotypes that we have about cultures. The stereotypes about cultures may entirely be accurate now, because cultures are systems. And systems are relatively unmovable. They change, but they change much slower across time. There are collectivistic systems as there are individualistic systems. But when you're on the level of people, it's a lot different. I don't think that we can always just take our stereotypes about culture and then apply them to people. And if you don't do that, I think I would have, or if you get that message, I think that I would have achieved my message for today. So thank you very much.